Percy Lefroy Mapleton was born in February 1860 in Peckham in London. His father was a naval officer, but his mother was a sickly woman and died when he was 6 years old. Unable to care for his son due to his heavy drinking, his father passed him to an aunt who brought him up. Like his mother, he too was a sickly boy, and his aunt spoiled him. On leaving school, he wanted to study law, but he failed to get on the course he wanted. In 1878, he posed as a theatrical agent and conned numerous actors into signing contract for a comedy which he said was going to tour theatres under the name of John Howden. Of course, he disappeared with their money and was never seen again. It was his ambition to be a writer, but the lifestyle and constant rejection resulted in failure. On Monday, 27th June 1881, Mapleton decided to take the train from London Bridge down to Brighton, a journey that took 90 minutes. He boarded the afternoon down train and, making his way through the first-class carriage, chose a compartment occupied by Frederick Isaac Gould. In his early 60s, Gould was a frequent traveller between his home at Preston Village near Brighton and the English capital. He owned a chain of bakery shops in London, and he and his wife Lydia lived in the East End before his retirement and buying a house at Claremont Terrace in Preston Village. Over time, he sold many of his shops, although retained one or two of them, and this was his reason for heading into London to check up on them. On this day, he'd visited his bakery in a shop on East Street in Walworth, in order to collect its takings, amounting to £33 in gold and 5 shillings. Gould always tried to find a first-class compartment that was empty, as he wasn't keen on strangers. He would then remove his hat, place a skull cap on his head, and if anyone entered, would pretend to be asleep. When the train arrived at Preston Park, the passengers alighted from it and handed over their tickets to the ticket collector. When the collector, Joseph Stark, opened the door of the first-class compartment, he saw a tall, young man, Mapleton, covered in blood, and his collar and tie were missing. The young man told the collector he'd been attacked, shot at 3 times, and struck on the head with a pistol. Gould, meanwhile, was nowhere to be seen. Stark helped Mapleton onto the platform, and when he asked his name, gave it as Arthur Lefroy, as he was settled into the ticket office. Here was also the station superintendent, Henry Anscombe. But something didn't sit quite right with Stark. For one thing, there was no one else in the compartment, and he noted a gold watch hanging out of his shoe. Police interviewed Mapleton at Brighton, but his recollection of what happened was vague. What he did tell them, though, was that he was attacked by a gentleman on the train as it went through a tunnel, and he'd fought back. Police, however, had also noticed the gold watch and chain in his shoe, and when questioned, Mapleton told them it belonged to him. He tried to say that either his assailant had placed it there during the scuffle, or he himself had placed it there, in a half-conscious state to protect his valuables. He also told them he was a journalist and had gone to interview Mrs. Nye Chart, the owner of the Theatre Royal. He went on that there were 2 men in the carriage, one aged around 50 and the other older. After they'd passed Croydon, he said he'd fallen asleep only to wake up in the bloodied carriage and having been robbed of 20 shillings. Mapleton's injuries were superficial, but attended to at the county hospital in Brighton. He was then escorted back to London on the up train by Detective Sergeant George Holmes, who was tasked with making sure he was okay. They stopped off for him to buy a new collar. Meanwhile, Gould's body had been discovered at Balcombe Tunnel by two plate layers, Thomas Jennings and his nephew Tom Jennings, where he'd been thrown out of the moving train. At first they thought it was a pile of clothes, but soon realised it was a body. His throat had been cut, and the body had been severely damaged from being pushed from a fast-moving train. A telegram was sent to Detective Sergeant Holmes, but it failed to reach the officer in time. Gould's body was removed to the Railway Inn in Balcombe. A doctor was called and examined him, and he was pronounced dead. When Holmes and Mapleton arrived at Croydon, a telegram was waiting for Holmes regarding the gold watch and its serial number. Mapleton got the number wrong, but made an excuse, saying the events had upset him. Holmes accompanied Mapleton to an address in Wallington in Surrey, where he waited outside as the man changed his clothes, but Mapleton gave him the slip and disappeared. Another telegram was waiting for Holmes, informing him of the dead man, that he had no watch, and had been the victim of a vicious murder. By the time he received the news, Mapleton was the prime suspect in the case. The first-class carriage was moved to a siding for inspection and was found to have bullet holes in the seat cushions and panelling, and blood was found in various places, including on a handkerchief and a discarded newspaper. Lydia Gould was informed later that night about the fate of her husband. On Wednesday, 29th June, the East Sussex coroner, Wyn Baxter, opened an inquest into the death, and the verdict returned was wilful murder at the hands of Mapleton. A post-mortem examination was carried out on Friday, 1st July, and Dr. Thomas Bond found a bullet mark under Gould's ear in his neck, but it didn't kill him, rather just stunned him, and that bullet was extracted from his spine. He'd been slashed around 14 times, but was found to have been alive when thrown from the train. He'd suffered a fractured skull, although the doctor believed this had happened post-mortem. His cause of death was syncope, or a brief loss of consciousness coming from shock and blood loss. He also didn't believe it was a man who'd simply walked onto the track, but believed it was murder. An investigation got underway swiftly, with a description of Mapleton appearing in newspapers. The Daily Telegraph even went so far as to publish a composite drawing of the wanted man, the first time this had happened in the history of crime. Mrs. Chart was tracked down and interviewed by officers. She informed them she had no appointments with Mapleton and had never met him. Knowing he was a wanted man, Mapleton managed to evade the police for a short time. He rented a room at Mrs. Vickers' house at 32 Smith Street in Stepney, East London, registering under the name of Clark. A cousin, Francis Seal, received a telegram asking for his wages to be sent there, so Seal informed the police of his whereabouts. The net was closing in. Gould's wife also made public the serial number on the gold watch and the name of its maker. This made it impossible for Mapleton to pawn it, and it was known Gould had no other items of any great value on him. When Inspector Donald Sutherland Swanson of the Metropolitan Police and his team of police officers found him on Friday 8th July, Mapleton was ill and half-starved. Bloodied clothes were found in his room, and the police already knew he'd pawned the revolver used in the murder. Mapleton stood trial at Maidstone in Kent before John Coleridge, Lord Chief Justice Coleridge, on Friday 4th November 1881. The prosecution case was led by the Attorney General Henry James, while Mapleton was defended by Montague Williams. In just 10 minutes, he was found guilty of murdering Frederick Gold by the jury and sentenced to death. The 21-year-old was hanged on 29th November at Lewes Prison by William Marwood, still maintaining his innocence.